advertising campaigns, and to actually attract viewers, you need to fend off anti-competitive practices from your competitors, and most importantly, you need to do this while you're not making money. This requires that you have enormous connections, that you have privilege. It's if you're from Stanford or MIT and you know people in the venture capital world and you're friends with them, that's when you get investment. In the comparative, it is far easier for underprivileged people, we think, to actually become entrepreneurs and to start successful companies. We think that these people are often talented, they often have great ideas, maybe because they have a unique experience on the world, but it's really hard for venture capital companies to invest in them in the status quo because, if the only thing you're looking at between two people is, who's more likely to take over the world, that's when your subconscious biases come in because there's no actual evidence of that. You just think, oh, this guy looks more posh, maybe I'll invest in him. In the comparative on our side of the house, if companies are judged on how much profit they can generate, there's a much more concrete measure where we think that minorities and other people are more likely to be able to show that their businesses are viable. They're more likely to get to initial startup. It's less likely their startups will fail. Obviously, there are other barriers to them too. We think this is an enormous one and will make a substantial difference if we oppose this particular trend. Two impacts. First, I think you get less innovation on their side of the house. That is to say, people from different backgrounds have different ideas. Like maybe if you're from India or you're from Sao Paulo, you know that there's a need for things that are like water purifiers. Whereas if you're from the United States, all you care about is fucking machine learning. Second, I think you get more inequality. I think that major corporation founders have enormous amounts of power. That is to say, Mark Zuckerberg literally gets to decide what is qualified as hate speech. Even if we change nothing else about these corporations, putting people who are from less privileged backgrounds means they're more likely to reflect societal values when they run these corporations. They have enormous power over us. It means that Facebook wouldn't have been, I think a POI from CO.
If it's true that these markets have a winner takes all advantage, why are these corporations even able to survive if they're not profitable?
So first, we think you can be profitable in the short term, even if it's not winner take all. So you can still get advertising revenue, like if you're competing against other companies. What you're defending is where you literally don't have any profit whatsoever, and you continuously plow that into more research and development. There are plenty of markets where it's winner take all, and you still have competitors, right? Like Uber and Lyft. We just think that they should not be spending so much money in R&D and trying to outflank each other. They should be making sure that they're making money in the short term. Second argument. I want to talk about why the failure rate goes up, and in particular, you get worse corporations on our side of the house. First, I think that this takes money away from, First, I think that this causes major corporations to make mistakes. That is to say, opposition is probably going to say that there are some monopolies on either side of the house. We agree with that. But if the route to becoming a monopoly is that you have to continually take money from investors who are telling you, don't focus on profit, just expand growth as quickly as possible, and there's this race to the bottom where whoever focuses on growth to the exclusion of all else is the one who actually ends up succeeding, we think that you're likely to make mistakes along the way. So for example, this looks like Facebook's data storage system, which was terrible when they first invented it because it doesn't actually matter to their ability to grow. And as a result, there were huge data privacy leaks. There were problems that I think were very hard for them to remedy later on because their entire infrastructure was based on this data they accumulated over 10 years, which was stored in a completely, in a bad format in a way that didn't protect privacy. I think on our side of the house, if you grow slower, you're more likely to take time to think about the long-term consequences, which is good for these companies. They just can't think about it on opposition side of the house. Second, I think you take money away from good corporations. That is to say, 90% of companies fail. So if there's all this focus on unicorns, they'll just invest in the biggest corporations, right? Because they're all sort of likely to fail. You invest in the one that has the biggest chance of success. I think that means that you don't invest in companies where there isn't a winner-take-all approach. You don't invest in things like biotech or drug development, where it's not obvious that someone's going to come and dominate the world, or you're going to get a normal amount of profit. I think those companies can do a huge amount of good for the world. I think you take lots of money away from them. I think the impacts here, you just get fewer products that help people, and you get companies which have bad incentives locked into the market. Third argument, you get faster and worse monopolization on our side of the house. We agree there are incentives for monopolization on either side of the house. I want to actually do some more responses to CO's POI and explain why on our side of the house, what you probably get is a slower development of these industries where you have a few different companies which are all making money at the same time. Why is this the case? Because it's true these are winner-take-all industries, right? So in the end, 30 years from now, the person who has the most consumers is likely to win the day. But I think that in the short term, that's no reason that you can't have 6 different social media companies, each with some users that is useful maybe in some regions, right? And I think that's what this investment would look like. And of course, if investors are only looking for profit, I think it's likely these companies will be profitable because they just won't put so much money into research and development that they're not profitable anymore. So I think what you get slower development. Initially you get investment in these industries that doesn't cause monopolization, even if there's monopolization in the long term. I think this is problematic for, I think this is actually really crucial, because what it means is that you have time for regulators to step in and regulate these industries before they become so powerful and they have such a grip over society that there's really no chance that the government can actually combat their effects. This looks like, for example, the massive increase in prices that Amazon has does. It looks like the massive anti-competitive practices of Google and Facebook, and the government can't stop them because, frankly, most politicians are reliant on Google and Facebook. It's extremely hard to regulate them. It also means you get less things like stock market bubbles because you don't have people investing in the same company over and over and over. There's actually competition. I think as a result, you also, and maybe even you get better effects on society. That is to say, you don't have one company which is monopolizing political speech. The point here is this: you have time to actually stop these companies before they become too powerful and they take over society. Very proud to propose.
Is the lacking comparative from Prime Minister, i.e., what is the comparative competition model that exists on government? We're not trying to get as much market share as possible. The first thing I want to note is that this directly responds to the case on being more inclusive, because precisely the bias of many investors towards already entrenched and large companies, given the safety of the profitability that exists for them, their ability to shed their losses in the instance of crisis, the capacity for them of already relatively safe business models, versus on our side, when you have the promise of being able to get larger market share in the future, it is far easier for small corporations, knowing there is the possibility for growth, as opposed to the already certain dividends and profits you already get from large corporations on their side. And that's the problem, because they say large corporations bad, but don't say large corporations that are profitable bad or large corporations with large market share bad. That's precisely what I'm going to deal with in the comparative. The second thing I want to note is that even when companies enter on their side, it's unlikely that they're able to survive on this profitability basis, because the large corporations that exist on their side already have significant amounts of capital, such that if they cannot compete on market share, it's more difficult for small corporations to do things like try and outproduce them, get the brand name that already exists for them, compete with distributors that they already have connections to, or a lot of the time, the additional money that they have is just used to buy out and have mergers with any kinds of competition, and therefore competition dies out in the long run anyway. So the problem with the profitability model as well is the failure to regulate often exists because the excess capital that corporations have as a whole, which on our side are likely to be used instead for expansion, innovation, and research and development in order to further the capacity to reach out to larger markets, end up becoming used for things like lobbying to be able to ensure that regulation is not likely to go against them. You're unlikely to have the same degree of excess capital on our side, and therefore beats their problem. Okay, the next thing I want to note is I don't think they ever named the ways in which they'd compete on the basis of short-term profitability. I would say on our side, the reason that Uber got so big is number one, competitive pricing, i.e. you have to have prices massively brought down from everyone on the market to have any chance of competing from you. And at the very least in the short term, I would note that many people access things like essential services like transport, or with Amazon, the capacity to have many websites that are able to start up as a result. Secondly, they venture into untapped markets, because for many people who don't have a sufficient purchasing power, these are not profitable markets, and therefore we're locked out of many institutions and like companies that did not want to cater to them, because even if they could afford the products to a degree, they were not profitable enough to set up infrastructure and set up the ability to market in these areas. For many of the untapped markets that exist, that I would argue are a significantly vulnerable population, more so than the poor venture business owners that they want to be able to protect on government, I would argue this is far more important. But thirdly is innovation, i.e. the rapid growth that they want to be able to spur is often like comes with important innovations that people would not have switched from existing corporations to go towards, as opposed to the general safety that profitability might offer you, and therefore the lack of ability to do things like promote innovation as a result. At best, they say that this innovation is dangerous because you're not likely to care about privacy. The first thing I want to note is that if you're on the basis of a market share, I'd argue if people opt out on the basis of Facebook scandals, etc., then that's more likely to happen. But secondly, if they don't, that probably means the essential service that they get is far more worth the kinds of products, or rather, far more worth than the potential data privacy breaches when you're able to do things like have internet access in many places that Facebook had like set up Wi-Fi for, when you're able to talk to your friends and sell things online that might be more important to you than the potential breaches of privacy. The important nuance here and distinction is that with a larger market, it's far more likely that the adjustment of a company is like greatly democratized to a larger group of people, as opposed to the exclusive group that is seen as profitable, the exclusive group that is seen as a safe market. And I would argue companies on their side are likely to adjust to and therefore are far worse. I'll take a POI from CG if they have one.
Yeah, the problem with this is that this is short-term.
You're very soft.
The problem is that this is short-term dumping when they increase the access to consumers, while on the other hand, they destroy the current access that they have. For example, rickshaws compared to Uber.
All right, so the next thing I want to do is explain why they won't abuse their position within the market. There are 3 reasons for this. Firstly, the other industry is still likely to exist for the same reasons of entrenchment that I've talked about. And the importance here is that if they're going to argue this doomsday scenario of monopolization happens in 30 or 40 or 50 years, there is a significant amount of time for things like regulation, a significant amount of time for competition to be existing, and a significant amount of time for the benefits I've talked about. So it's not just a short-term price dumping that does not last very long. But secondly, consumers can opt out because they are loss averse and therefore would not have simply like wanted prices to suddenly rise as a result. And I'd make the argument that insofar as it's like rather the increase in prices is likely to significantly deter the kinds of market share that they will be able to get on initially. A lot of investors who believe in this to be the general growth model for the corporation are likely to be averse towards decisions that are going to significantly alienate like a share of the like market. Lastly, is that because this is the general approach within businesses, the potential for new entrants to do the same thing means that you do not want to suddenly raise prices insofar as a new entrants that will likely disrupt the market, as they might argue, are going to decrease the market share that you have as a result. And therefore, this deterrent is significant because if you could do it, it is likely that other people within the market are able to do so as well. And therefore, it's not likely, maybe they do things like increase the prices by a little, but it won't be to the significant degree of harm, and it's likely to still be comparatively much cheaper than the existing businesses that had existed before, and therefore that's just not likely to be the case that exists on opposition bench. Lastly, what are the ways in which they make money and why is that a good thing? The first thing I want to note is the network effect that open government talks about either means that if it is winner take all, and this is a worst case that they become incredibly large corporations, as they point out, if it is winner take all, then they don't assure the profitability on their side if you benefit significantly, or rather if you need a significant market share for the business model to operate in the first place. But secondly, the ability to have network effects is generally very efficient, i.e. when you have Uber, where you have a maximum number of drivers and riders, it means that you can pick the best kinds of trips that you can take, the most near driver, etc. And therefore, these network effects, by increasing the amount of people that operate and exist within this kind of corporation, are likely to be good. But secondly, they don't just raise the prices. A lot of the time, it is by making money on scale, i.e. because the fixed costs of your operation are likely to be cheaper because of the large scale of the company that you have. It's much safer for you to operate on scale rather than jacking up prices and significantly reducing that consumer base, and therefore that beats the closing government POI as well. But thirdly, I would note that this entrenchment exists also within largely the developed world, and I'd argue a lot of corporations within the developing world that need to be able to have some degree of competitive advantage, that don't have the fancy mechanisms for production and other things that large developed country companies might want, are therefore far more accessible for markets to not only democratize within nations, but outside nations as well. What do I prove in this speech? Number one, that in the short term, the benefits are likely to accrue that they never contend with. Number two, that they're not likely to abuse the position that they hold in the future. But number three, that in the future, they hold a significant market share. It's not likely that it's going to operate by simply jacking up prices. There's significant disincentives to do that. They're likely to operate much better. I am incredibly proud to oppose.
opposition is out of this debate at the point at which they do not understand exactly what types of companies we're talking about. I want to give 2 points of characterization that I think defeat the vast majority of their substantive material. First, the companies that we are talking about are not challengers to established, developed markets, i.e., they're not challengers to Facebook or Amazon or Google. Why? Because in any of those instances, if you're trying to compete with Google or with Amazon, Google and Amazon will just buy you out. That is, there is no way that you're able to successfully establish a competitor, because as soon as your startup gets slightly large enough, Google just goes and buys you out. Second, why is this not challengers, which beats all of opening opposition to material about how you won't be able to have small companies challenge big companies? Second point of characterization. I don't think that this is never, second point of characterization. This never trades off with investing in conventional developed industries. That is, it doesn't trade the VC market and stock market are two different things. Why? The kind of VC investors that we are talking about are looking to invest in risky things. That is, if you just wanted to have a reliable return on your money, you would simply go invest in the S&P 500. So this beats OO's argument about how you get more bias towards safe industries on our side of the house, because we think the exact point of having VCs is that you invest in riskier ventures that have a higher rate of return. I want to talk about, I think, 3 to 4 things in this speech. One, I'm going to talk about why this beats all of OO's material. Second, I'm going to give new substantive about why the money trades off with investments in biotech companies and essentially in the developing world. Then I'm going to talk about why these companies succeed, and finally, why these companies are more likely to succeed on our house, and finally, monopolization. First, on access. Azure tells you 2 reasons why it's more likely that you have massive bias towards Stanford and MIT grads, as opposed to maybe not like super underprivileged people, but at least people from state schools who are not the who are not the 1% of our world. That is, one, that you need massive amounts of money over long terms of time. So you don't just need a seed grant, you need consistent VC funding for 40 years, which means it's incredibly difficult to consistently gain that kind of money without having a substantial amount of connection to the VC world and being able to sustain those connections over a long period of time. But second, that the way in which money is dispersed is substantially less democratic. That is, on their side of the house, when you're looking to invest in things, you go to the founders and you're like, how much promise does a startup have? How much vision does a founder have? We think those are totally ridiculous. We strongly prefer that they make these decisions on the basis of your quarter 1, quarter 2 profits, which we think are substantially easier, even for those who are underprivileged, to be able to have access to them. Because at least the the understanding how to build a nice food chain is a little bit more understandable than how to smooth with the VC. This beats everything on opening opposition, because OO's best argument is about how you get fewer nice products like Uber on Facebook on our side of the house. Guess what? That is already happening. It's happening to a significantly larger degree at the point at which you are shutting out large percentages of people who might be able to identify problems that the people in Silicon Valley do not. So you get substantially better products on our side of the house versus we're going to give reasons why it's unlikely to affect whether or not these products survive on our side of the house. I'll take CO.
Yeah, you say that this is VC, so they care about growth, which means that it's unlikely, even in your case, that all we're going to care about is quarter 1 and quarter 2 profits. It still takes billions of dollars to start a company. You still have to sell vision. You still help the MIT grads.
Okay, first of all, it's a comparative debate. If you want to just minimize the difference between 2 sides, that's not going to be good for you. But second, it is different, because the difference between having to sell your company once and having to sell it continuously to hundreds of different investors over 30 years is actually pretty big. But also, we think that at the point at which, we also think you substantially reduce the prioritization of growth. All right, next, new substantive about why this trades off substantial amounts of money to better enterprises. First, I should already told you that this massively trades off with investment in things like biotech and things like drug development that we think tangibly help people. But second, we also think that it trades off with essentially with investment in developing countries. A couple of reasons. One, we think asset prices in the West are super high, interest are super low, which means that investors like hedge funds are looking for risky investments that have huge upside returns. Second, we think that normally investors would invest in corporations in the developing world, e.g. building factories in Thailand to take advantage of the cheaper labor there. But instead, we think that they focus on huge unicorns like Amazon, because that is substantially riskier, which means that they're substantially less likely to invest in the developing world. The impact of this is just like you get less investment to people who need it substantially more. Like, I don't care whether or not not Boston has good Ubers. I think it is much more important that people who need the access to things like internet, as OO says, get it more. So I think that outweighs all of their impacts. Next thing I want to talk about, why are these companies likely to succeed? And note that this is where the vast majority of OO's case is hinged, because I think they seem to think that the comparative is that there isn't going to be Facebook or there isn't going to be Uber. There's a lot of problems with this characterization of the world. That is, first we think that it's more, why these companies likely to succeed. First, Asher gives you reasons why they can succeed. That is, even a Facebook that doesn't monopolize the market can still, if it has enough people on it, even like a small percentage of people on it, can just raise lots of money from ads revenue. And in particular, we think it's more likely to be profitable in the short term if you don't need to plow tons of money into research and development to beat your competitors. Second, they might say that this research and development is good and makes, increases innovation. Maybe CEO will say this. The problem is we think it's not used for good ends. That is, either it's used to increase monopolization, i.e. in Amazon doing market research to just increase their ability to sell things to people, or B, we think that it's literally, you just get patent trolls like Microsoft or Google who invest tons in startups and buy them, and they have all these nice patents, but they don't need to use them because they're already monopolies, so they just sit on them. To this, OO says a couple of things. They say you need tons of money for infrastructure, i.e. you can't have Uber and the comparative. The problem is you can still have this network effect on a smaller scale. You can still have Uber in New York City, which means this isn't necessarily true. The other thing, but second, Asher gives you a proactive reasons why you get higher failure rates in our world, because we think if you grow faster, you're more likely to make mistakes. You're more likely to have data privacy problems that hurt you in the long term. So we think that you're less likely to make success in your own. But even if that's not true, we prefer that these. But even if that's not true, we think that these companies are bad. Finally, let's talk about monopolization. Why this outweighs, we think, all the stuff about these companies not existing. They say a couple. Asher gives you reasons why you get faster monopolization that prevents the ability of regulators to crack down on this, and also why you just get more monopolization because that's what investors reward. OO says that monopolization takes too long. No, Amazon didn't take 40 years to take over the market. It took 10. The point is, if it's a good product, you get very high growth rates. The other thing they say is that you decrease money because it's safer and you don't have an incentive and you want to avoid new entrants. The problem is, if you're a monopoly, you can just reduce prices temporarily to shut out new entrants, so you steal the monopolization. Even if none of that is true, we prefer these companies simply not exist. That is, they have massive amounts of leverage over the government. That means that they can hold governments hostage in order for them to do their will. We also think it trades off with government services, i.e. if Facebook providing internet, the government has less incentive to. We don't think these companies are good for their world. We think the comparative is much better. Proud to propose.
In 3, 2, 1. The problem with OG is that they think that these companies exist in a vacuum where they never had any potential competition. Prior to Amazon or Uber, the industry was dominated by taxi cartels and big box retail and had even the greater problems existed under their side. Or if they talk about totally new industries, which is not true for Amazon and Uber because they were competing with the transport and retail sector, it means that prior to them, the markets did not exist. So a lot of people were underserved, not given access to services in the first place. That is the comparison that opening government failed to deal with, and that's why they're actually the ones out of this debate. The first question I want to ask is, how do we increase competition? So OG's first claim is, we want to support budding entrepreneurs who are underprivileged or smaller players entering. I want to point out that they don't respond to all the mechanisms coming from Miko about why it's harder for a smaller business to get short-term profitability. If you're competing with already established businesses, you're going to lose out because the cost of your good is significantly more expensive than a corporation that's able to get good suppliers. You're not able to have the same distribution chains, and therefore you cannot even make more money out of scale. You have to make your money out of pricing it very, very high, which means that you're unlikely to become successful. You have to get things like brand marketing, which means that you're going to spend a lot of time on advertising in the short run, which means that you're unable to actually make the money in the first 2 quarters, which is literally the metric of short-termism that opening government said to be. That means, while it might be hard for a budding entrepreneur to promise the world they're able to capture the market share, that speculation of possibility is greater than the certainty of impossibility of showing 2 quarters of profitability for a lot of the corporations that exist right now. But secondly, if the context is they're competing in a totally new market, At best, they can only get investments for non-innovative industries or non-important industries to try to get growth. Because for you to be able to make short-term profit, that means you can't have massive infrastructure spending. That means you can't have spending on building a lot of roads or projects, because if not, you have massive costs you can't recruit until the roads are built already or until the infrastructure is built. That means you can maybe have mom and pop shops under their side, but if things are innovations that actually change the world, they're not able to get under our side. I agree. It's hard also for underprivileged people to persuade venture capitalists to get their share on our side. We're just saying it's comparatively easier when you can promise projections as opposed to the certainty of numbers. The last thing they then say is try to be sneaky here. They say VC invests on both sides, so they still want to be risky. This is not valid, because the reason why VC is risky is because they buy into the strategy. They don't care about short-term profitability right now, and they care more about growth because they're able to get a lot of money. Insofar as your ability to get short-term profitability is one of the determinants of how risky your company is. Because if you're short-term profitable, that means you have less liabilities and costs to pay on. You can potentially get dividends in the case your company fails already. That means to a degree, there's some people who are risky, willing to invest on their side. The amount of people who are willing to invest on their side decreases if the strategy does not exist, because they don't think it's a lucrative or business-minded strategy for them to take place. They can just opt or benefit by saying the risky people on the other side, marginally they're less on their side. I want to break down competition now into two parts. First, companies that try to compete with past industries. Why are we better off? We explain that these are companies already, the comparative is it's dominated by the taxi monopoly or taxi cartels, etc. In the short term, we clearly win, right? Because in the short term, we note that Uber massively reduced prices, Airbnb massively reduced prices, Amazon massively cut out the middleman and a lot of the retail. And therefore, a lot of consumers are better off. But secondly, because there's more options for people to work, like taxi drivers have more choices, even employees are better off because they have more options for employment. In the short term, we win. And I want to say that even if CG is good at proving that in the long run, it's worse off. The long run is just significantly less important because we don't know what can happen in the long run. It's entirely possible to elect like a labor or a left-leaning politician who wants to regulate businesses. It's entirely possible there's new competition that comes up that tries to reduce competition. So the certainty of at least 10 to 20 years of short-term profits, like Amazon has not really increased prices for the longest period of time, is significantly more important than potentially long-term growth. But let's deal them with their best metric. Even in the long run, why do we think we get significantly more competition? I want to note that even if Uber raises its prices right now, it's significantly still better than the comparative, where taxi cabs charge significantly higher for poorer services. So at best, it is par. But there are a couple of reasons why they're unlikely to increase prices. One is because when the strategy is in effect, they fear future players might also use a strategy to topple them later on when they abuse their market position. Secondly, the endowment effect by Richard Thaler suggests that people or companies are more averse to raising prices because people react more to that than when they lower prices because they think they're losing money and people are naturally loss averse. Thirdly, because the past industries are still there. So if you massively increase your prices, then the taxi cab industry becomes more successful and tries to back you up. And therefore, at best, you still have some competition in the long run. Before we move on, CG.
So if the future is so uncertain, that means that these investments are also uncertain as well, right?
Yeah, but I would suggest that to a degree that you have a strategy and people are more willing to invest in this particular strategy. Okay, secondly then, totally new industries or places. But before that, because I wanted to preempt the argument, they're going to say it's risky for investors. I actually don't care about the interests of investors. The vast majority of venture capitalists are somewhat rich already, and that's the investors that opening government identified. They have more savings than workers or consumers. Secondly, the fact that a lot of investors also have other ways to hedge the risk, for example, investing in safer industries. And if we're talking about middle income or retail investors or smaller people, a lot of them invest in hedge funds, which diversify the risk already. So maybe some investors lose out their money in risky businesses. That's less important than in consumers and workers on our side. But secondly, totally new industries or places. I want to point out that even if opening government is correct, that they have a monopoly over these places, they don't deal with a comparative of services not being provided at all, which is significantly greater under our side. So their argument that we're not able to go to developing countries actually falls under their side, because a lot of times developing countries are not profitable in the short run. You have to build the roads, you have to build the utilities, you have to build and train a lot of people and a lot of workers, which means that you can't get profitability in the first 2 quarters. We get it under our side, but also underserved communities within the developed world that we're able to get. Notably, even if they're monopolistic, at least they provide some services that some people might be able to benefit from. At least they're able to invest in some jobs, pay some taxpayer money, and therefore better off. The last thing I would do in extension is point why sustainable practices are more likely to exist under our side of the house. Why? I would suggest a lot of sustainable practices like entering to green technology, not harming the environment, require a lot of short-term cost investment. So for example, transitioning to invest in sulfur scrubbers or green technology, for example, or sustainable agricultural systems. In fact, the comparative of short-term profit usually harms the environment the most. It is people being willing to invest in things like slash and burn farming because it's cheapest for short-term profit rates, or things like bribing potential officials or bullying your market position. These things are significantly more likely on their side when companies only care about the short-term profits of corporations right now. In comparison, when they're okay with having short-term costs, they're far more likely to invest in a lot of industries later on. We win this debate because even if opening government is correct, that there are some corporations that are abusive, the comparative is worse. And if CG tries to run an argument on the investors, I explain why it's significantly less important than the people who are benefited by this policy, as I am very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thanks for that speech. The member.
This is not an inherently profitable model. There have been hundreds upon hundreds of companies failing on this model, which is why CA teams think that the motion about startup development models is a balanced motion recently. However, the problem within this motion is there's an inherent positivity bias, because the average small investor who holds a stock share in Uber, the average investment fund, mutual fund, or pension fund, which ties middle-class people, not rich venture capitalists opening opposition, has far more access to positive stories than negative, because the articles you're going to read in mainstream media or in financial magazines are going to be, here's why XY company succeeded, not here's why XY company failed. You listen to TED Talks or speeches in the Oxford Union from Jeff Bezos, from the people who own Uber, therefore you get a perception you're an idiot if you don't try to rake in. This then creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, because small startups who are trying to enter the market, insofar as they see as investment, which they need because they can only be profitable long-term, is being funneled into this model. They are forced to switch to this model, even if it were not profitable for them, because otherwise they cannot access investment. These are companies which do not have the contingency capital that Jeff Bezos has, which means that you're creating a trend of switching the economy to an unsustainable model, which creates disbalances in the provision of utilities and services, creates unpredictability, and drives the companies who would create the R&D that opening opposition wants out of business. But it also means the industry is inherently prone to risk, which we're going to talk about later. Oh, as for an alternative, it exists. Look at the IT market, for example, like Apple, Samsung, Nokia, multiple companies in competition. Tech market like LG and Siemens, car market. All of these grew prior to this new trend, which means it is possible empirically for companies to balance profitability and growth. The problem within the debate is the trend. Insofar as companies are forced to shift to this model, they are, because it's path dependent, not because an alternative doesn't exist. I just want to add a couple of other reasons why I think this is inherently risky. First of all, it's harder to regulate. Number one, it's hard to regulate a single gatekeeper who has interest in being able to keep prices low, therefore is going to lobby harder. But second, also a larger share of the market is tied to this gatekeeper, which means that it's inherently more risky to try to regulate. But secondly, note that insofar as this becomes a trend, and most pension funds, mutual funds, small investors have their money in this, you are directly screwing over the purchasing power of your citizenry if you potentially try to regulate and provoke a reaction from that company, which means you electorally have no incentive to do this, which means it's more risky in terms of causing bubbles, but it also defeats opening opposition's point on access. Yes, they're going to lower price and pay workers more while they're capturing the market share. Once they do, they have absolutely no incentive not to dump prices at the point where they've already captured the market. And the market capture is the warrant that opening opposition gives for these companies being profitable. So they have to accept monopolization, and they're not going to get access. But lastly, even if you buy, like in their best case scenario, these are hugely profitable and smart models, external shocks happen, and they happen often. The 2008 crisis spilled out far beyond housing. We have oil crisis, 73, 79, recently with Russia. We have fucking COVID, pandemics are likely to happen in the future. Insofar as external shocks are very common, we do think that this model needs to be impervious against risk. Even if we've already proven that you create a huge amount of companies that are going to be unprofitable, I'm going to claim that even these companies who have succeeded in capturing a significant amount of the market share are still at risk of bubbles, and why this is bad. I'm giving you multiple reasons for this. Why do we think this is problematic? First of all, when a stock market bubble happens, people lose money. So literally people who had this as their contingency capital, had this as their savings, had this for dark days, are going to lose money all of a sudden. This creates huge unpredictability within the economy, encourages thrift, therefore discourages spending. Secondly, insofar as one bubble happens, people who have investments in similar models, which have proven are now going to be more prevalent, are now going to be more risk averse, which means that they're either one, going to try to sell off all their shares and stocks at once, which creates debt deflation, which means a huge amount of small and middle class individuals lose their money all at once unpredictably, which again discourages spending and is the beginning of a crisis, This is literally what happened in the housing market with the housing crisis, when everyone tried to sell off mortgages and people lose money because they try to sell houses all at once, or people stop investing in these types of models because they believe they're more likely to fail, which means that a huge amount of startups which need the extra capital to enter the market and to survive long term are not going to get that capital, because once one huge bubble happens, once it creates a crisis like 2008 for 2 fucking years, nobody's going to invest in this anymore, which means you build an economy on a model which is no longer sustainable, and you drive the research and development out of business. Even if this doesn't happen, note it's a huge risk. When these crises happen, they crush the entire economy. The 2008 crisis ripple effects fucking today, which means that the risk of these happening and harming millions of people is a sufficient reason for us not to opt for this model, given the existence of an alternative and given the harms that may happen. An additional harm I want to posit can happen is fucking market realignment, because insofar as this model is specifically based on driving competition out of business very quickly, not in Eastern Europe, pretty much all taxi drivers like switched to Uber or started beating up Uber drivers because they hate them for cutting down their prices. This means that insofar as this company can fail at some point, it creates a huge market distortion, because number one, it means that the utility which was provided exclusively by one actor is no longer provided. You need to wait the time for a new actor to enter the market and establish. This also means a period for market prices to establish themselves. There's price volatility, but there's also a necessary period for supply and demand to balance out and for price to become accessible. This means in the interim, you create huge unemployment for people who work for this company because they have no other competition to work for. In the interim, you create huge debts towards suppliers which are unserviced, which means that a huge amount of, subsidiaries within the economy or intermediaries within the economy also fail when they provide intermediary parts or things like this. Insofar as I've given you multiple reasons why there's a risk of this failing, and insofar as the risk in and of itself is hugely harmful to individuals, we think that we should hedge against that risk and not go for this model. But lastly, even if you don't buy the risk argument, I'm going to argue why this screws over crisis recovery measures. Before I talk about that, I'm willing to take opening opposition to let them engage.
Yeah, so crisis happens once every 2 decades or whatever, but there are mechanisms to mitigate that, like having rollouts, etc. But the fact that in the other times of the world, there's less investment in developing countries, how do you deal with the starvation and poverty that exists then?
In developing countries, the companies that are going to go after this trend because they have to and need to get investment do not have the cushion capital of Jeff Bezos and are more likely to fail. You don't get the benefits there. Secondly, we literally had multiple crises in 2008 in the US, 2016 in Greece, 2020 with COVID, not to mention all of the oil crisis. It happens relatively often. And lastly, I gave you 5 mechanisms why this is hugely risky. This PUI does not do much. Why does this harm crisis recovery measures? Note that in situations of crisis where this is particularly relevant, because you need to get the real economy pumping back again, central banks do a number of measures to pump liquidity, like they pump fiscal packages, they have like bonds which people can acquire, they set low interest rates. The problem is when this model and trend is prevalent, the people who are going to access this money, the investors, the mutual funds, the pension funds, the investment funds, are not going to pump this money into short-term recovery measures, like investing in companies which are already sustainable, so having Carrefour or Walmart open 10 more shops and get people more access to cheap goods and actually getting the spending and taxation running. They're not going to invest in R&D, which can diversify the economy in the short term. They're not going to invest into expanding the service sector. They're going to invest in an inherently speculative market, which generally only benefits the rich, but it also means that recovery measures become inefficient in times of crisis. This becomes even more problematic because given that this model is based on a prediction of future growth, these companies keep rising in stock value even as the real economy is falling in value, which means that once the bubble breaks and once recovery measures fail, you do not have a cushion for the economy to bear that brunt. This is the problem of them growing while the economy is falling, and why this is most relevant in times of crisis, even if they happen rarely, and they don't. For all of these reasons, closing government has won this debate.
is they go for the extreme low-hanging fruit of companies where there are already existing monopolies. Hence the reason why they use the taxi card example about 1,000 times in the OO case. The problem, though, is that this isn't the main context where monopolies and these big firms which are going to aggressively subsidize themselves in order to forego profit exist for the very reason that they identify, i.e. that these things, if I'm low cost, are much more likely to happen when there are new markets. CEO is going to enter this debate by refocusing the op case on the context where it is the most likely, i.e. green tech, green energy, technology, culture and entertainment, and explain in all of these cases where you don't have a competitor shanking you while we still get massive benefits. Before that, responses to the two main contributions we get out of CG. The first thing they say is that it's really bad to have these companies because it's incredibly hard to regulate them. Three responses. The first is, this is hung not on them having huge market shares, but rather on them being large companies. The problem then is that they have lied about the economy because TIN does 2 minutes of impacting, but the core mech is two things. The first is that you're the sole provider and it's therefore hard to compromise your performance by like regulating you. The problem though is that VC is a small subset of the overall market, and indeed the majority of people aren't hugely affected by it because they are invested in other consuming other goods. For those phases, you're much more likely to be able to regulate them than conventional monopolies. But the second main thing is just it's not true that you have market failure when you regulate any company that aggressively pursues market share at the cost of profit. It's only true when it's a massive firm like Amazon that already has lots of people dependent on it. It's unlikely to be these companies that you need to regulate or else risk collapse for a couple of reasons. The first is because oftentimes these companies take a long time to grow. If there are problems in their business model, then they are usually readily apparent before time comes. And the other main reasons, because in order to invest, people often also take close looks at the way they're balancing revenues and costs if you have huge amounts of liabilities and loans that would make you collapse if you stop making so much profit, for example. It's unlikely that they can reach such scale. Finally, then, the only other method they use to prove that they're likely to collapse is that pension funds have invested aggressively in these companies. This is extremely unlikely because pension funds want reliable returns and therefore are unlikely to go for companies in the private sector, rather than tend to go for ETFs, other things that are quite reliable. So for those reasons, CG, lots and lots of impacting, built on quite fragile and flimsy mechs that I think Greg will have more fun with later. Okay, two main contributions then. The first is we're going to go further than OO because they do a good job of touching on all the relevant impacts in the op case like R&D, consumer benefits, monopolization, but they've underdone the key link on opposition, which is why foregoing profit in the short term is necessary condition for all benefits. And that's important because Gov has very smartly tried to co-opt their benefits by saying, oh, this is achieved by other large companies as well. So then why is it that this process of having really low profit to maximize growth is necessary? Because there are often extremely high costs associated with the new industries that I flagged in my introduction for a few reasons. The first is oftentimes you're developing goods that there is no clear market for yet. For example, green technology isn't an incredibly huge market because people already have alternatives. Electric cars, also not a huge market. But the second main thing is that there's also extremely expensive infrastructure, which means that you have to buy. You can't have as much profit before going extremely mainstream because you're ahead of the curve, right? For example, EV vehicles can't make enough money right now because batteries just aren't good enough, are not frequent enough to make their use plausible. But finally, there are often networking effects that require scale to ever be profitable in the first place, not just in O's case when monopolies are excluding you. First of all, because oftentimes you need huge amounts of consumers in order to pay off all of your goods to make one, your R&D worth it, but also such that the fixed costs are set off. But also because oftentimes there are distribution problems, which mean that you need to be very popular and to lay down these pipelines before you're able to have any sort of profit. What's the harm of this to the Gov side? Two things. The first is, I think in their worst case scenario, they have to bite much slower growth, i.e. you have to wait for consumer demand to catch up for you to have that profit before you start this development. That's really bad because the subset of goods that we're talking about are often crucial for the future, right? Because there are often things such as green technology. Actually, it's mostly green technology. And that's really bad because that means that on their side, they have to wait for oil and gas prices become much, much more expensive and for there to be a small crisis before you start transitioning over. Whereas on our side, this aggressive capture of market share means that such a transition would be much less costly, more effective, and also better for the environment. But second of all, even in the very best case scenario where there are current people trying to develop them, I think it's actually even worse, right? Because here are the companies who are able to put money into the thankless research and development. They're likely to be large companies who already have a revenue stream and who have a vested interest in making sure that they are the ones controlling the rollout of these equipment. That's why British Petroleum is actually the current company with the biggest amount of funding to the development of green energy right now, because that means that they are the primary shareholder in the majority of startups and can do things to just stop the rollout of solar panels that they would aggressively threaten their user base, or just do things just to make sure that they have complete control of the whole situation. And that's also extremely bad because one, it makes it much, much harder to to scale out to British Petroleum and other like oil and gas and fossil fuels because we're pretty dependent on them. But it's also bad because it means that they have absolute control in the long term. Before I go to my second extension, I'll take OG.
The debate isn't do you not invest in long-term startups, it's do you not invest in long-term startups that require massive market share to be profitable. Why is that true of green tech companies, given that they're already profitable?
I mean, I don't think they're currently profitable. I mean, if you say that they're currently profitable, then they're profitable because they're doing things such as getting in more investment from other investors, right? And that's the case. And like, that happens for the same reason that our companies get a lot of investment, i.e. they're able to signal to the company that they're a good option, to the market that they're a good option that is likely to earn more money in the long term. But second of all, on our extension, that is, I think that we also get way more diverse companies, which I think beats the OG case. That is, on our side, when you invest when there's investment into companies that are very, very low profit and big market share, what this means is that it signals to venture capital companies that it's not necessary to just invest in companies that have large profit streams right now, but rather that any good idea is good. That's really important because then the bar to reach for unicorn startups and companies is no longer, I need to be sustainable, I need to capture large enough of market to actually get profit, but rather I need to have enough of market share in order to catch the attention of Google or Amazon or some other startups that I'm bought up. That's really valuable because that actually means that making a startup is much more accessible, which beats all of the OG claims on how it's really, really bad because it's exclusive and it makes it harder to set up a business without a huge amount of capital backing you. For all of those reasons, I think we've proven a higher burden than OO and beaten many of the OG benefits. Very happy to oppose.
I'll start soon. Okay, engagement with closing opposition, then why we win. So first on the regulation point, problem is that quick growth reduces the ability of governments to regulate gatekeeping, shutting down competition, not enabling SMEs to advertise their service on your platforms, or as the opening and the closing opposition call it, networking effects. The comparative is obviously that these are not natural monopolies, as was considered by opening opposition, which is the problem which CEO says, oh, we can't regulate it and we regulate natural monopolies. But these are created monopolies, given that the services existed before, but there was one company which was enabled by the huge amount of capitals that they had to create a monopoly on the service. So this is why this type of regulation is harder on a comparative and much worse than if you have a bunch of other providers which you can regulate more easily, which are not new and they don't have new business models. Secondly, on the environment, I think the POI from Open Government was really badly responded by the member of the opposition. But also the problem with CEO case is that investment into green technology happens normally. This is a slow, certain progress on the market capture where you bet the long-term game, as opposed to a sudden, abrupt change in the market share where you could, capture 50% of the market in the next 5 years. This seems to really be supported by them saying that, the Shell and all of these other big companies are betting on this, which is not the business model which was characterized in the rest of this debate. But also, this seems really the opposite of what, according to opening opposition, Uber is doing by pumping out internal combustion cars in the developing world where they didn't previously largely exist, therefore, possibly harming the environment, according to opening opposition, is what these companies are doing mostly. So I think that they would have to reconcile their stances with their opening bench there. Look, response to opening opposition and recharacterizing this debate, and primarily on why they don't understand systematic risk, neither of the opposition teams. When we talk about investors, they say investors are rational and can diversify. Problem is, that's not the case. You can't have smaller margins forever. You can't preach diversification and instability when there is a bull market. And there is a bull market such big that even Warren Buffett cannot withstand it. So even if you invest in a fucking index, which is now, like most of these pension funds, let's say, invest, but that's not completely true. They also invest in like separate companies. If this index is under the influence of a huge bull run market, if the index has changed from, Carrefour and companies who've been there for 100 years to more Ubers and more companies that arrived there yesterday, this makes the index more volatile and more risky in and of itself, given that this is the peak diversification that you can do in this sort of situation. So the problem with this is that because everyone invests in this and there is no way for you to diversify, or you're going to get crushed by the other 10 guys who have a margin of 5% and you have a margin of 2%. Therefore, this is a systemic risk for the economy. The problem with opening opposition response is they say, but systemic risks do not often manifest themselves. I think the thing proved basically that they do often manifest themselves, but that they also carry risks in and of themselves. And I think that we prove by the stability of market and the economy, this leads to more stability and the opportunity for growth and long-term development. But also, I think that the problem is that this limits government policy in peaceful times, let's call them, in of themselves. Because if you want to reduce speculation on the stock market, if you want to reduce some of the steam happening there, you necessarily also screw the real economy, which is why the problem with COVID and the response to COVID was, stock market is booming, but on the other hand, real wages for people who are poor are falling. This is the problem, that you reduce the ability of government to be a cushion for when bad things happen, and this is the problem that they also have to face on their side of the house. But we're also going to engage with other things which they prioritize in this debate, and this is the idea of how this offers like new opportunities. Look, new markets offer new opportunities for players. People buy on internet, and if you are an internet platform. Similarly, if you have a new business model, i.e. connecting consumers and providers directly, this has a benefit in and of itself, which is why the characterization from opening opposition, where they seem to forget about the middleman, and there's no other way other than really abrupt growth for you to be profitable, is not true. So there's a middle road to this, right? You get there, you have a new business model, you capture the market slowly, you're not aggressive in dumping the prices. Because what opening opposition seems to talk about is, no, they only use this money for research and development. That's not true. They use it for dumping, marketing, advertising, below price acquisition of inputs, because they have a huge amount of capital, which is other firms do not. So this is how they acquire the market, and this is how they could do it otherwise with their real competitive advantages that they have. But what happens with access for consumers? We concede there is a period where consumers have a lower price of service. We posit this is a temporary benefit. This destroys the current, possibly expensive but established and permanent way of doing business, such as rickshaws, bikes, local stores. The fact that consumers opt out of higher prices destroys competition while they can foot the bill for losses on their side of the house. So this is where opening opposition shoots itself in the foot. The argument that there is a perpetuum mobile of new entries to the market is a false one. Given that the first mover has significant advantage, given that they can dump prices when the new company is entering, thus making the entry unviable as it did in the first place, but also the network effects that opening opposition mentioned. But even if this works, this creates huge market changes and turbulences. It is unreasonable for consumers, for providers, and generally for the regulators as well, and for the tax services to pay up with these constant market entries and market exits. This is a problem. This is a problem for the economy in and of itself, that this is a friction in the economy, which causes a lot of unemployment, which causes a lot of loss in service, which causes a lot of tax to, for example, not be credited because you have problem with regulation and maybe new business model entering. So this problem, that there is a likelihood of failure of these companies in and of itself, is a worse one in the end than the potential temporary marginal increase in the access to the service, which is what the opening opposition's argument is. But I don't want to take them now to engage.
Actually, having less firms operating is riskier for recessions because other companies who can't compete are no longer able to stabilize the economy by diversifying it. So if these companies fail, then they cause massive risks in recessions. Having more companies being able to enter the market actually reduces your recessionary risks, which engages you in your best case.
Guys, you have to defend higher market concentration. which means that what you basically just said is against your case, because there's more companies on our side of house, or at least they have a way lower market share than the top one company. So I really don't understand. Okay, so what about network benefits and economies of scales? Recognize that this argument works only if there is a monopoly that is happening. I can't get a cheaper offer from Mercedes-Benz for my new S-Lines if I'm Uber, if there are 10 other providers who are buying the same amount. They're just not going to give it to me. So networks have bad effects on consumer arbitration and price gouging. And this is horrible for drivers as well, whose conditions generally decrease, or for businesses who Amazon screws over with margins, or employees as time passes and they need to increase their margin on all of this. So in the end, we show you there's a huge possibility for gatekeeping. There are systemic risks to this. The comparative with how it was before is not that awful as closing opposition wants us to believe with the environment. So this is why they take this debate in the end. Thank you.